The whispers cut through the cathedral like knives through silk. 300 guests sat in polished pews beneath vaulted ceilings that had witnessed generations of wealth binding itself to more wealth, power cementing its hold through carefully orchestrated vows. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light across marble floors worth more than most Brooklyn neighborhoods. Flowers imported from Ecuador and Holland decorated every surface, their combined cost exceeding what Marcus Sullivan earned in 6 months of 16-hour days. He stood at the altar in a suit that didn't fit right. The jacket pulled across his shoulders, the pants broke awkwardly over shoes borrowed from a man whose feet were half a size too large. The fabric was expensive, chosen by people whose job was selecting expensive things, but it hung on his frame like a costume, like proof of something everyone already believed about him. Beside him, Sophia Whitmore sat in her wheelchair, wrapped in white silk that caught the light like liquid pearl. The dress had cost $40,000. Marcus knew because he'd overheard the seamstress mention it to one of the bridesmaids, her voice carrying that particular tone people used when discussing amounts of money that existed in a different universe from the one where you counted quarters to see if you could afford milk and bread in the same trip. The wheelchair was sleek and modern, nothing like the clunky hospital equipment Marcus had seen during the endless months of Isaiah's recovery. Chrome and leather. Elegant in the way objects became when money transformed necessity into statement. Sophia's dark hair was swept up, revealing the graceful line of her neck, her hands folded in her lap with the stillness of someone who had learned to hold herself perfectly composed while the world watched and judged. A man in the third row leaned toward his wife. His voice carried, despite his attempt at discretion. He sold himself for her money. The woman's response came wrapped in manufactured sympathy. A black man with nothing, marrying a crippled billionaire. How convenient. Marcus kept his eyes forward. His father had taught him that much, back when the old man still lived and worked 40 years at the same factory before they let him go 6 months before his pension fully vested. Keep your eyes forward. Keep your dignity. Let them say what they'll say because their words can't touch who you are unless you let them. But the words still landed, still accumulated like small cuts that individually meant nothing, but together painted you in blood. Someone else chose. Then Sophia moved, her fingers tightened on the armrests, knuckles going white against the chrome. The motion drew every eye in the cathedral. 300 people held their breath as she pushed, as her legs trembled, as she rose slowly from the chair that had defined her for 18 months. She stood fully, her legs holding her weight, her spine straight, her chin lifted. The gasp that swept through the cathedral was like a wave breaking against rocks. Collective shock that echoed off the vaulted ceiling and crashed back down on them all. In the front row, Victoria Whitmore went pale, her carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time in decades. The minister stumbled backward, his prepared words dying in his throat. Board members and society matrons and old money families all stared with mouths open, their certainty about how the world worked suddenly called into question. Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him. He'd suspected something, noticed small things that didn't align, but seeing her stand was different from suspecting. Seeing her stand, here, now, in front of everyone who had judged them both, was a revelation that changed the shape of everything. Sophia's voice when she spoke was steady, carrying clearly through the stunned silence. I can walk. I've been able to walk for 18 months. The image froze. Marcus's face, shock and confusion and something deeper written in the lines around his eyes. Sophia standing, no longer the woman in the wheelchair, but something else entirely. Something none of them had prepared for. But to understand why this moment changed everything, why it mattered beyond the spectacle and the gasps and the social earthquake rippling through Pacific Heights society, you had to go back. 6 months back, to a different November morning in a different world, where the only earthquakes were personal, and the only gasps were a father holding his breath in the dark, listening to his son cough. November arrived in Brooklyn with the kind of cold that found every crack in old buildings and exploited them. The heating in Marcus Sullivan's apartment had been shut off 2 weeks earlier, adding to the stack of past due notices that lived on the kitchen counter like a paper monument to everything he couldn't control. He'd hung blankets over the windows, stuffed towels under the doors, done everything the internet suggested when you typed "how to keep apartment warm without heat" into a library computer because he'd sold his laptop 3 months back. Isaiah coughed in the dark. Short and dry, not the deep rattle that used to send them running to the emergency room, but enough to pull Marcus instantly awake. He lay perfectly still in his own bed across the room, listening, counting the seconds between breaths. 5 seconds. 6. 7. Normal breathing resumed. Just a cough. Just a regular, ordinary cough like healthy 10-year-olds had all the time. Marcus let himself exhale. The apartment was 1 room plus a bathroom, 3rd floor of a building that had been nice once, maybe in the 70s before landlords discovered they could extract maximum rent for minimum maintenance. Isaiah slept on a fold-out couch beneath layers of thrift store comforters. Marcus had given him the good blankets, the ones that still held heat, keeping for himself the thin cotton one with holes worn through from too many washes. He pushed himself up and walked barefoot across the floor to the kitchen. The linoleum was ice against his feet. The refrigerator hummed and clicked, working harder than it should because the seal had failed and no one was coming to fix it. Marcus opened the door. The light inside flickered twice before stabilizing, illuminating half a carton of milk dated to expire tomorrow, 3 eggs, and bologna that was 2 days past its sell-by date, but still looked okay. He cracked the eggs into a pan. No butter because that was gone. Just eggs on metal. Behind him, small footsteps shuffled across the floor. "Daddy." Isaiah stood in the doorway in pajamas that had fit him 6 months ago, but now hung loose on a frame that should have been bigger. 10 years old, but small for his age, the doctor said, blaming the heart condition that had required surgery 2 years back. That surgery saved his life. The debt it left behind was destroying Marcus's. "Morning, little man. Wash your face. Breakfast is almost ready." They ate at the small table by the window that looked out over the street 3 floors down. Marcus gave Isaiah 2 eggs and kept one for himself, moving it around his plate to make it look like more. His stomach growled, but he'd learned to ignore that particular complaint. He'd also learned to claim he'd had a big lunch at work when Isaiah's eyes lingered too long on the single egg. Had a huge sandwich at the shop. "I'm not that hungry." Isaiah ate slowly, making each bite last. He'd learned that too, the way children learned when meals weren't guaranteed. The way no child should have to learn. "Daddy." Isaiah's voice was quiet, eyes on his plate. "Tommy told me something yesterday." Marcus kept his own voice steady. "What did he say?" Isaiah's fork moved the eggs around without lifting any. "He said people like us don't get nice things. He said I wasn't born for that." The fork in Marcus's hand bent slightly where his grip tightened. Tommy was a classmate whose parents owned 3 car dealerships across Queens and bought him new shoes every month like shoes were disposable. Tommy who brought $50 lunches to school and threw away whatever he didn't finish. "Tommy's wrong." Marcus set his fork down carefully, meeting his son's eyes. "You deserve everything, Isaiah. Everything good in this world, and I'm going to make sure you get it." Isaiah nodded, but the doubt remained in his eyes. Marcus hated seeing it there. Hated that his son, at 10 years old, had already learned to question whether he deserved the same things other children took for granted. Hated that he'd put that doubt there through circumstances that felt increasingly beyond his control. After breakfast, he walked Isaiah to the bus stop. Other children waited in warm coats with working zippers, clean sneakers, without holes. Isaiah wore a thin jacket held together with duct tape and shoes with cardboard stuffed inside to cover where the sole had separated from the upper. Marcus had tried to make the cardboard look intentional, like a design choice, but cardboard was cardboard and other kids noticed. The bus arrived. Isaiah climbed on without waving goodbye, finding a seat near the back, shoulders hunched against the weight of being different, being less. Marcus stood alone at the corner long after the bus disappeared, hands shoved in his own inadequate jacket, breath visible in the cold air. This was his life now. 2 jobs, sometimes 3 when he could find the work. Days at the auto shop fixing other people's cars while his own sat repossessed in some lot across the city. Nights stocking shelves at the grocery store, moving boxes and scanning inventory until his back screamed and his hands cramped. Weekends taking whatever work appeared, day labor and handyman jobs and anything that paid cash without asking too many questions. And still, every month, he fell further behind. The medical debt from Isaiah's surgery hung over him like a sentence handed down by a judge he'd never see. $127,000. The number had a weight to it, a physical presence that sat on his chest when he tried to sleep. It grew with interest faster than he could pay it down, compounding monthly at rates that seemed designed to ensure he'd never escape. Last week, an envelope had arrived from the bank. "Third notice," the letter said, as if the first 2 hadn't been clear enough. The mortgage on this apartment, the small piece of his mother's legacy that was supposed to give Isaiah stability, was 3 months overdue. Foreclosure proceedings would begin in December if he couldn't pay. 14 days from now. He'd already sold his car, sold his mother's jewelry, the pieces she'd worn to church every Sunday and left to him with instructions to give them to his wife someday. Sold her furniture, her television, anything worth converting to cash. He'd taken loans to pay other loans until the spiral seemed endless and purposeful, like the system was designed specifically to catch people and hold them under. Marcus walked to work through streets that smelled like coming snow. The auto shop was 3 miles from the apartment. He used to drive. Now he walked and told himself the exercise was good, the fresh air was good. Anything to reframe this particular loss as something other than failure. The shop was warm at least. Heat and the smell of motor oil and the steady work of fixing things that could be fixed. His hands knew the feel of engines, the logic of mechanical systems where cause and effect followed predictable patterns. Hydraulics and pistons and timing belts, problems that had solutions if you understood how the pieces fit together. Marcus was under a pickup truck, replacing a transmission mount that had failed when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. The phone buzzed again. Twice more. He slid out from under the truck and checked the screen. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him swipe to accept. "Mr. Sullivan." The voice was female, formal, clipped in the way voices got when they'd been trained to speak to people like him. "My name is Rosa Martinez. I knew your mother years ago, before she passed. We lost touch, but I've kept track of your family from a distance." Marcus frowned, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag that was already more grease than fabric. The name sounded vaguely familiar, something his mother might have mentioned once, but the memory wouldn't solidify into anything useful. "I know this is unexpected," Rosa continued without waiting for him to respond. "But I need to speak with you. It's important." Marcus looked at the transmission mount still half installed, the work that needed finishing before the end of his shift. "Important how? Can you come to the Whitmore Hotel this evening? 7 o'clock. Ask for me at the front desk. The Whitmore Hotel." Marcus knew it the way everyone in the city knew it, the building that towered over everything else in Pacific Heights, all glass and marble and doormen in pressed uniforms. The kind of place where a cup of coffee cost more than he spent on groceries for a week. "I'm not sure." "Please, Mr. Sullivan." Rosa's voice lost some of its formality, revealing something more human underneath. "This concerns your son's future." "Your future." Then she hung up, leaving Marcus standing in the shop with a phone in one hand and grease under his fingernails, wondering what kind of future could possibly come from a conversation at the Whitmore Hotel. That evening, Marcus stood outside the building feeling completely displaced. The hotel rose 30 stories above the street, glass reflecting the evening sky like it owned the light itself. People walked past in clothes that cost more than his monthly rent used to be before he'd fallen behind on that too. Leather shoes that shone, coats that fit, jewelry that caught the light and announced its value without words. He almost turned back. Pride and shame warred in his chest, pride insisting he belonged anywhere he chose to stand, shame whispering that everyone could see exactly how he didn't. But Rosa had said this concerned Isaiah's future, and Marcus would walk through fire for that boy's future. So walking into an expensive hotel barely registered as difficulty. The doorman's eyes tracked him from half a block away. That particular kind of tracking Marcus recognized, the visual assessment that happened in seconds and concluded things about who belonged and who didn't. But the doorman held the door anyway, professional enough to keep his judgment internal, and Marcus stepped into a lobby that looked like something from magazines he couldn't afford to buy. Rosa Martinez was waiting in a private lounge on the 3rd floor. She was thin and in her 60s, with sharp eyes and expensive jewelry that somehow didn't look ostentatious on her. She gestured to a chair across from where she sat, her movements economical, practiced. "Sit down, I'll be direct." Marcus sat, back straight, meeting her eyes. Direct worked for him. I work for the Whitmore family. Rosa folded her hands in her lap. I've been their head of household staff for over 20 years. Victoria Whitmore, the family matriarch, has a daughter named Sophia. You may have heard of her. Marcus shook his head. He didn't follow news about billionaires. That world existed on a different plane from his own, one he'd never expected to intersect. Sophia inherited Whitmore Medical Technologies after her husband died 3 years ago. Rosa's voice remained level, giving facts without judgment. She survived the same accident that killed him, but she's been in a wheelchair ever since. She's become reclusive, bitter. Her mother is concerned about her future, about the family legacy. Marcus waited. The direction of this conversation hadn't revealed itself yet, but he could feel it coming, could sense the shape of what Rosa was building toward. Victoria is looking for a suitable husband for Sophia. Rosa leaned forward slightly. Someone stable, quiet, willing to accept certain conditions, someone who won't make waves. The words landed with the weight they carried. Marcus stared at her, waiting for the punchline, the moment when this became something other than what it appeared to be. You want me to marry her? I'm presenting you with an opportunity. Rosa's expression didn't change. The arrangement would be contractual. You would sign a prenuptial agreement. You would have no claim to her assets. But in exchange, your debts would be paid. Your son's medical care would be covered for life. You would never worry about money again. The amount of money implied in "never worry about money again" was staggering. More than Marcus had ever imagined having, more than he'd earned in his entire working life combined. Enough to bury the $127,000 that haunted his sleep. Enough to keep the apartment, buy Isaiah new shoes, stop counting quarters. Why me? Rosa's face remained neutral. Because you're desperate enough to say yes, and decent enough to honor your word. Victoria has rejected dozens of candidates. They were too ambitious, too greedy, too obvious. You're none of those things. I'm being chosen because I have nothing. You're being chosen because you have everything to gain and nothing to leverage. Rosa stood, smooth and final. Think about it, Mr. Sullivan. I'll give you 1 week. She left a business card on the table, heavy cardstock with embossed lettering that probably cost more per card than Marcus's phone bill. Then she walked out, heels clicking against marble, leaving him alone in the empty lounge with a choice that felt like drowning or burning. No good options, just different ways to lose yourself. Marcus sat there for a long time after she'd gone. The card remained untouched on the table in front of him, white against dark wood, impossible to ignore. His mind cycled through everything Rosa had said, every implication and assumption. A marriage for money. A contract. A transaction where he signed himself over in exchange for survival. Everything inside him screamed no. He thought about his father, who'd worked 40 years at that factory and died with his dignity intact, even if the company had stolen his pension. He thought about his mother, who'd raised him to believe integrity mattered more than wealth, that a man's worth was measured by his character, not his bank account. He couldn't do this, wouldn't. Selling yourself for money was a line you didn't cross, no matter how desperate you got, no matter what excuse you wrapped it in. But that night, after he'd walked home through streets that smelled like snow and climbed 3 flights of stairs in a building that had no heat, after he'd checked on Isaiah sleeping under every blanket they owned, Marcus sat in the kitchen with the business card in his hand. Isaiah had asked him a question earlier, during dinner. They'd been sitting on the fold-out couch sharing a blanket because the apartment was too cold. Isaiah struggling with math homework, his breath visible in the air. Daddy. Isaiah hadn't looked up from his worksheet. Are we going to lose the house? Marcus's heart had stopped. Where did you hear that? I heard you on the phone. You were talking about money. Isaiah finally met his eyes. Are we going to be okay? Marcus had wanted to lie, wanted to promise that everything would be fine, that he had it all under control, that their world was stable and secure. But Isaiah had learned to read his face too well, learned it during those terrible months in the hospital when promises felt cruel because outcomes weren't guaranteed. I'm working on it. Marcus had pulled him close. I'm going to figure something out. Isaiah nodded slowly, then asked another question, quieter than the first, devastating in its simplicity. Is it my fault? Because of my surgery? The words had hit Marcus like physical blows. No! He'd gripped Isaiah's shoulders, fierce and definite. Don't ever think that. Your surgery saved your life. That's all that matters. Everything else, the money, the bills, that's not your burden. That's mine, okay? Isaiah had buried his face against Marcus's chest. I just don't want to be the reason you're sad. Now Marcus sat alone in the kitchen, turning Rosa's card over and over, watching light catch the embossed letters. He thought about Isaiah asking if it was his fault, thought about the doubt in his son's eyes when Tommy said people like them didn't deserve nice things, thought about all the things Isaiah had already learned to live without, new clothes, warm meals, a father who wasn't exhausted all the time, a future that looked like something other than more struggle. Marcus had always believed that integrity was worth more than money. He still believed it. But integrity couldn't pay for Isaiah's medications. Integrity couldn't keep a roof over their heads. Integrity was a luxury you could afford when you weren't counting quarters to see if you could buy milk. What was his pride worth if Isaiah grew up believing he wasn't born to have nice things? What was his dignity worth if his son carried the weight of medical debt that wasn't his fault, that he'd done nothing to earn except have the audacity to survive? Marcus picked up his phone, dialed the number on the card. Rosa answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. I'll do it. The words came out steady, surprising him with their certainty. But I want to meet her first. I want to meet Sophia. That can be arranged. Rosa's voice betrayed nothing. I'll be in touch with the details. The line went dead. Marcus set the phone down and stared at his hands. They were rough from years of labor, scarred from countless repairs, calloused in places that would never soften. Working hands. Honest hands. He wondered if those hands were about to sign away everything he believed in. For Isaiah, he told himself. This is for Isaiah. But even as he thought it, part of him knew this choice would change him. That once he stepped through this door, there would be no stepping back. The man who walked out on the other side would be different from the man sitting in this kitchen, and he couldn't predict whether that difference would make him someone his son could still be proud of. He just hoped it would make him someone who could give his son a future worth having. The Whitmore estate sat behind iron gates at the end of a private road that wound through hills Marcus hadn't known existed within the city limits. Rosa had sent a car, black and sleek and worth more than 5 years of his salary. The driver hadn't spoken during the 40-minute trip. just guided the vehicle through streets that got progressively cleaner, houses that got progressively larger, until they arrived at gates that opened automatically as they approached. The house beyond wasn't a house. It was an estate, a monument, a statement about wealth so vast it needed to be displayed across acres of manicured grounds. Stone columns rose 3 stories high. Windows reflected the winter sky like the building was made of mirrors and glass, and money transformed into architecture. Marcus had never seen anything like it, couldn't conceive of what it would be like to live in a place where you needed maps to find rooms, where staff outnumbered family, where every object cost more than everything he'd ever owned combined. The car stopped at the front entrance. The driver opened Marcus's door without a word. Marcus stepped out into cold air that somehow felt different here. Cleaner, maybe, or just filtered through the consciousness of extreme wealth. Rosa appeared before he could knock. She wore a different suit than last time, but the same expression, neutral and assessing. "You're on time." "Good. Come with me." She led him through a foyer larger than his entire apartment. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed impossibly high, their light catching on marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of stern-faced men and elegant women who looked down at Marcus with expressions he recognized. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of people who believed they were better than him simply because of what they owned, who they descended from, which side of town they lived on. They stopped outside a set of double doors. Rosa turned to face him, her expression slightly less neutral than before. "Sophia is inside. She knows who you are and why you're here. I suggest you be honest with her. She despises pretense." Before Marcus could ask what that meant, Rosa opened the doors and walked away, leaving him standing in the hallway alone. The room beyond was a study filled with books and leather furniture that looked like it had been there for generations. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through air that smelled like old paper and furniture polish. And there, near the fireplace, sat Sophia Whitmore. She was beautiful. That was Marcus's first thought, immediate and undeniable, and he felt ashamed of it, as if noticing her beauty somehow diminished her, reduced her to something he had no right to assess. She had dark hair pulled back from a pale face, high cheekbones, eyes that studied him with an intensity that made him want to look away, but didn't let him. Her wheelchair was sleek and modern, chrome and leather, nothing clunky about it. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, watching him cross the room toward her. "So, you're the one Rosa found." Sophia's voice was cool, detached, the voice of someone who'd learned to keep the world at a safe distance. The desperate single father willing to marry a cripple for money. Marcus stopped walking. "Is that what you think I am? I don't know what you are yet. That's why you're here." She gestured to a chair across from her. "Sit." He sat. The leather was soft, probably cost thousands. "Everything in this room probably cost thousands. My mother wants me married," Sophia continued, her eyes never leaving his face. "She believes a husband will stabilize me, give the company confidence, produce an heir to continue the family legacy. She doesn't care who the husband is as long as he's controllable." Her gaze held his, direct and challenging. "You're here because Rosa thinks you fit the criteria. Poor, desperate, unlikely to cause problems. Your friend isn't wrong about the first 2 things." Marcus kept his voice level. "And the third, I'm not here to cause problems. I'm here because I have a son who deserves better than what I can give him." Something flickered in Sophia's expression. Not warmth, nothing that soft, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Tell me about your son." So Marcus told her. He talked about Isaiah, about the heart condition diagnosed when he was 5, about the surgery that saved his life when he was 8. He talked about the debt that followed, the medical bills that compounded faster than he could pay them. He talked about the foreclosure notice, the mounting pressure. the way Isaiah had started asking if everything was his fault. He didn't embellish or seek pity. He simply told the truth, laying it out the way you'd lay out parts of an engine you were trying to understand. When he finished, Sophia was quiet for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with consideration. Most men who come here try to impress me. She spoke finally, her voice softer than before, but no less controlled. They talk about their accomplishments, their ambitions, all the things they could offer me. You just told me how much you failed. I haven't failed my son. Marcus met her eyes. Not yet. That's the only thing that matters. Sophia studied him the way someone might study an unusual painting, trying to determine if it was genuine or a clever forgery, trying to decide what value to assign, what category to place it in. We'll see. She turned her wheelchair slightly, a dismissal as clear as words. Rosa will show you out. Marcus stood. He'd been here less than 10 minutes, said maybe 200 words, and already it felt like he'd been weighed and measured and found wanting, or maybe found acceptable. He couldn't tell which would be worse. Rosa was waiting in the hallway. She walked him back through the foyer, through passages that felt longer on the way out, past wealth displayed so casually it might as well have been ordinary. At the door, she paused. Sophia usually sends candidates away after 5 minutes. You lasted 20. Marcus wasn't sure if that was encouragement or warning. He walked to the car, climbed in, let the driver take him back through gates that closed behind them, like a door shutting on a world he'd glimpsed but not entered. That night, he lay awake in the cold apartment, listening to Isaiah breathe in the darkness, and wondered what he'd just set in motion. 2 weeks later, Marcus signed the prenuptial agreement in a conference room that overlooked the city from 40 floors up. The document was 47 pages long, filled with legal language that wrapped itself around concepts like waiver of rights and separation of assets and null and void in perpetuity. The lawyer, a man named Richard Blackwell, who wore cufflinks that probably cost more than Marcus's rent, walked him through each section with the careful precision of someone explaining terms to a child. You understand that you will have no claim to Mrs. Whitmore's assets. Richard's voice was professionally neutral. No ownership of property, no financial rights of any kind. In the event of divorce, you will leave with nothing more than you brought to the marriage. Marcus understood. The terms were clear. He was signing away any claim to anything Sophia owned, which was everything, in exchange for having his debts erased and Isaiah's future secured. A trade that looked terrible on paper, but felt like the only option that led anywhere except deeper into the hole he'd been falling down for 2 years. In exchange. Richard continued, flipping to another page. Your current debts, totaling $214,000, will be cleared within 48 hours, Sim. A trust fund of $500,000 will be established for your son's education. You will receive an annual salary of $50,000 for the duration of the marriage. Marcus let the numbers wash over him. $214,000. The amount that had been crushing him, making it impossible to breathe, would simply cease to exist. Gone. Erased. Like it had never happened. And Isaiah would have $500,000 for college, for his future, for whatever he needed. Marcus's mother had cleaned houses for 40 years and left him $30,000 in life insurance. Isaiah would have more than 10 times that. Guaranteed, secured, untouchable. The pen felt heavy in his hand when he signed. Each page required his initials, his signature, his acknowledgement that he understood what he was agreeing to. Marcus signed them all without hesitation, without reading the fine print, because the broad strokes were clear enough. Victoria Whitmore sat at the head of the table, watching with cold satisfaction. She'd insisted on being present, Rosa had explained, to ensure everything was handled properly. She wore a suit that looked like it cost more than a car, her white hair styled perfectly, diamonds at her ears and throat. Old money personified, generations of wealth that had never known what it meant to choose between heat and food. You didn't even read it. Victoria's voice carried that particular tone people used when they wanted you to know they were judging you and finding you wanting. Most careful observation wrapped in concern. I read enough to know what I'm agreeing to. Marcus set the pen down. I understand the terms. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. At least you understand your position. This is a business arrangement, Mr. Sullivan. Nothing more. I expect you to behave accordingly. Marcus met her gaze. I understand perfectly. He wondered if she could see what he was thinking. That her position looked a lot like buying a person, and his position looked a lot like being bought, and neither of them could pretend this was anything other than what it was. A transaction. A contract. An exchange of his time and presence for money that would save his son's life, or at least save it from the poverty that killed futures as surely as any disease. 3 days later, Marcus moved into the Whitmore estate. Living in Sophia's world felt like being a ghost haunting someone else's house. Marcus was given a room in the West Wing, far from the master suite where Sophia stayed. The room was larger than his entire Brooklyn apartment, decorated with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. 4-poster bed with curtains he didn't know what to do with. Dresser that was actually called an armoire, which Marcus only learned because Rosa corrected him when he called it a dresser. Windows that overlooked gardens maintained by a team of groundskeepers who arrived at dawn and disappeared before dinner. He was afraid to touch anything. Afraid his rough hands would damage surfaces meant for gentler treatment. Afraid he'd break something worth more than he'd ever earned and somehow end up even more in debt than he'd started. Isaiah came on weekends. Rosa had arranged it, worked it out with the school and the lawyers and whoever else needed to approve a 10-year-old boy spending time at an estate worth more than small countries. The first weekend, Isaiah had walked through the front door and stopped, overwhelmed, his eyes going wide as he tried to process the sheer scale of everything. "Daddy." His voice had come out as a whisper. "There's a room just for watching movies." Marcus had knelt down, brought himself to Isaiah's eye level. "I know, it's a lot, and the kitchen has 3 refrigerators." Isaiah's eyes were still wide, still processing. 3. Why do they need 3? Marcus didn't have an answer for that. He didn't have answers for most of what existed in this house. Why anyone needed rooms they never entered, furniture no one sat on, art worth millions hanging in hallways where barely anyone walked. The logic of extreme wealth was its own language, and Marcus didn't speak it. The staff treated him politely but distantly. They opened doors and called him sir and brought him meals he didn't ask for, but their eyes said something different. Their eyes said they knew what he was. A transaction. A convenience. Someone who'd married for money because he didn't have any other options, because people like him only got into places like this by selling something, and what he'd sold was himself. Victoria made her contempt clearer. She appeared at meals with pointed comments about Marcus's background, his lack of education, his unsuitability for their world. She never insulted him directly. She didn't need to. Every observation was delivered with a smile that made her meaning unmistakable. "I understand you were a mechanic." She examined him over the rim of her wineglass at dinner one evening. "How interesting that must have been, working with your hands." "Honest work." Marcus kept his voice even, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. "Of course, there's dignity in labor, they say." Victoria's tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort, though I imagine it's quite different from the work we do here. Managing a medical technology company requires a certain sophistication. She let the word hang in the air between them. Sophistication. Code for breeding, for education, for all the things Marcus didn't have and couldn't acquire by wanting them. You were either born into sophistication or you weren't, and Victoria wanted to make absolutely certain he understood which category he occupied. Through all of this, Sophia remained distant. They shared meals in silence, conversations limited to necessary logistics. She spent most of her time in her study, attending to business matters Marcus wasn't privy to. When they passed in hallways, she nodded acknowledgement but rarely spoke. The wheelchair moved between them like a wall, defining space, creating distance that felt intentional. But sometimes Marcus caught her watching him. When he helped a maid carry boxes she was struggling with, thanking her by name because Rosa had made sure he learned all the staff names. When he sat with Isaiah on the floor in the library working on homework, both of them cross-legged on expensive carpet like they used to sit on the floor of their old apartment because they didn't have a table. When he paused at paintings in the hallway, not pretending to understand them, but simply looking, taking in color and form without needing to perform appreciation. She watched, and she said nothing, and Marcus couldn't tell what the watching meant. The first time Sophia truly spoke to him beyond logistics and necessary exchanges was 3 weeks after he'd moved in. Marcus couldn't sleep, his body still adjusting to the silence of wealth, the absence of street noise and neighbor arguments and sirens. He'd wandered downstairs sometime after midnight, hoping movement would tire him out enough to rest. He found Sophia in the garden. She sat in her wheelchair beneath a canopy of stars, her face tilted toward the sky. Even in the darkness, Marcus could see the traces of tears on her cheeks. He should have walked away, given her privacy, respected the distance she'd maintained so carefully. But something made him step forward instead, some recognition of isolation that matched his own. "Can I sit with you?" Sophia didn't look at him. "Do what you want." Marcus sat on a stone bench nearby. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the silence between two people who'd run out of reasons to pretend. Finally, Sophia spoke. Her voice was flat, as if she were reciting facts from someone else's life. "My husband died 3 years ago. The same accident that put me in this chair. His name was Jonathan. We were driving home from a fundraiser. A truck crossed the median. He died on impact. I spent 4 months in the hospital." Marcus said nothing. He simply listened, giving her space to fill or leave empty as she chose. "After I recovered, everything changed. Friends who had visited every day stopped calling. Business partners who had respected Jonathan treated me like a child who couldn't understand complicated matters. Even my own mother started speaking to me differently, slower, simpler, as if the accident had damaged my mind along with my legs." She finally turned to look at him. "Do you know what it's like to become invisible? To have people look at you and see only what's missing?" Marcus thought about the way strangers clutched their purses when he walked by, the way employers interviewed him with suspicion already in their eyes, his skin color answering questions before he opened his mouth, the way Tommy's father had looked at him at a school event, like Marcus was something unpleasant that had wandered in from the street, something that needed to be kept away from the good families and their properly raised children. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." Something passed between them in that moment. Recognition. Understanding. Two people who'd been diminished by the world finding unexpectedly someone who saw them clearly, who understood what it meant to be reduced to a single characteristic and judged accordingly. Marcus told her about his life then, not because she asked, but because the silence invited honesty. The years of working double shifts, believing hard work would be enough if he just kept going. The wife who'd left one morning with nothing but a note saying she couldn't watch him struggle anymore, couldn't bear being married to someone who would never have enough. The nights he and Isaiah had slept in his car, because rent took priority over shelter and the car at least kept most of the rain out. The shame of watching his son learn to expect less, to make himself smaller, to apologize for taking up space in a world that made clear he wasn't welcome. "I used to believe hard work was enough." Marcus heard the bitterness in his own voice and didn't try to hide it. That if I just kept going, things would get better. Now I'm not sure what I believe anymore. Sophia was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the armrest of her wheelchair. "My mother thinks I agreed to this marriage because I gave up." Her voice was soft but certain. Because I'm broken and tired and willing to settle for any arrangement that makes my life easier. She met his eyes. She's wrong. I agreed because I was curious about you. Curious how? Rosa said you were desperate but decent. I wanted to see if those things could coexist. Sophia's gaze held his. Most people hide their desperation behind ambition. You hide yours behind silence. I'm not sure which is more dangerous. Before Marcus could respond, she wheeled herself back toward the house. Good night, Marcus. He watched her go, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not love, nothing that defined yet, but recognition. The sense that maybe in this transaction they'd both agreed to, in this marriage that was supposed to be nothing but contract and convenience, there might be something more complicated trying to form. Something real, maybe, or something that could become real if they let it. The outside world was less kind than the insulated reality of the Whitmore estate. As news of the engagement spread through social circles and eventually to media outlets hungry for stories about wealth and scandal, the whispers grew into a roar that reached everywhere Marcus went. Neighbors who had barely known him in Brooklyn now had opinions they shared freely with anyone who would listen. Former co-workers at the auto shop shook their heads when his name came up, their judgment wrapped in pity that felt worse than contempt. Strangers on the internet, people who'd never met him and never would, called him names he tried not to read but couldn't completely avoid. Gold digger, opportunist, a black man preying on a disabled white woman who couldn't defend herself. The cruelest comments found their way to Isaiah despite Marcus's attempts to shield him. One afternoon in late December, Marcus picked up his son from Whitmore Academy and found him waiting on the curb with red-rimmed eyes and shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. Other children streamed past toward waiting cars and drivers, their laughter and casual conversation highlighting Isaiah's isolation. What happened? Marcus knelt on the sidewalk, bringing himself to eye level, one hand on Isaiah's shoulder. Isaiah wouldn't look at him. Nothing. Marcus knew that particular nothing. The nothing that meant everything, that carried weight too heavy for a 10-year-old to hold alone. Isaiah. His voice stayed gentle but firm. What happened? Isaiah's voice cracked when he finally spoke. Tyler said you're a bad man. He said you're only marrying that lady because she's rich and you're too lazy to work for real. The words landed like punches Marcus had been expecting, but still wasn't prepared for. Tyler was one of Isaiah's classmates, a boy who'd been friendly before, who'd invited Isaiah to his house once, whose mother apparently had opinions she shared at dinner tables where her son absorbed them like lessons. His mom told him that. Isaiah continued, tears threatening to spill over. He heard her talking on the phone. She said people like us are always looking for handouts. People like us. Code so thinly veiled it was barely code at all. Marcus felt something cold spread through his chest, anger mixed with helplessness, the familiar combination of knowing exactly what was being said and having no way to fight it without confirming their assumptions. What did you say to Tyler? Nothing. Isaiah's voice went even quieter. I didn't know what to say. Marcus pulled his son into his arms and held him tight on that sidewalk, while expensive cars pulled up and other families climbed in and drove away to houses where these conversations never happened, where children didn't have to defend their father's choices or explain why they deserved to exist in spaces other people thought belonged exclusively to them. What Tyler's mom said isn't true. Marcus leaned back, gripping Isaiah's shoulders so his son had to meet his eyes. But I need you to understand something. People are going to talk about us. They're going to say things that aren't fair. And sometimes we won't be able to change their minds. So what do? All we can do is know who we are and not let their words make us forget. Isaiah nodded slowly, processing. Okay, Daddy. But that night, Marcus noticed his son had stopped mentioning Tyler altogether. Another friendship lost. Another piece of normal life carved away. Another cost of the choice Marcus had made. one he hadn't fully calculated when he signed those papers. He began to wonder if he'd traded one kind of poverty for another, if losing yourself could happen just as easily through having too much as through having too little. The confrontation with Victoria came 3 nights before the wedding. Marcus had been in the library looking at photographs on the mantel. Old pictures of Sophia as a child before the accident, before the wheelchair, before whatever had happened to steal the smile from her face. In the photos, she'd been laughing, running, arms spread wide like she was trying to embrace the whole world. He hadn't seen her smile once since they'd met. Hadn't seen her look at anything with that kind of unguarded joy. "You're still here." Victoria's voice cut through his thoughts like glass breaking. "I admit I'm surprised. I thought you would have taken a better offer by now." Marcus didn't turn around. What better offer? Victoria walked into the room, her heels clicking against hardwood with the precise rhythm of someone who'd spent a lifetime commanding spaces simply by entering them. She stopped beside him and produced an envelope from her jacket pocket. $2 million. She held the envelope out, her manicured fingers steady. "That's what's inside this envelope." "A cashier's check made out to you personally. Take it and disappear. Go build a life somewhere else. Forget you ever met my daughter." Marcus looked at the envelope. $2 million. Enough to pay every debt he'd ever had and still have enough left over to buy a house, start a business, give Isaiah everything Marcus had ever dreamed of providing. Security for life, freedom from worry. The kind of money that changed not just your circumstances, but your children's circumstances, and their children's after that. Why? "Because I know what you are." Victoria's voice hardened, losing the veneer of civility she usually maintained. "You're a poor black man who saw an opportunity and seized it. There's no shame in that. It's simply survival. But you don't belong in this family and you never will. Take the money. It's more than you'll ever earn on your own." Marcus finally turned to face her. "You think this is about money?" "Everything is about money, Mr. Sullivan. Anyone who says otherwise is either lying or foolish." Marcus looked at the envelope for a long moment. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it, and he saw Victoria's expression shift into satisfaction, certainty that she'd been right all along about who he was and what he valued. Saw her preparing to dismiss him, to erase this inconvenient complication from her carefully ordered world. He tore the check in half, then tore it again, and again, until the pieces were too small to be anything but confetti falling to the floor between them. Victoria's composure cracked for the first time since he'd met her. "What are you doing? You can think whatever you want about me." Marcus's voice stayed level, each word deliberate. "You can call me poor, desperate, beneath you. Maybe you're right about some of it, but I'm not something to be bought off like a problem that needs to go away." He dropped the torn pieces at her feet. "And neither is your daughter." Victoria's face twisted with fury that had probably been building for weeks, maybe months, constrained by the need to maintain appearances, but finally released by Marcus's refusal to follow the script she'd written. "You'll regret this." The threat was clear despite the controlled volume. "I'll make sure of it." She stormed out, leaving Marcus alone with the ruined check scattered across expensive carpet. He stood in the silence for a long time, feeling the weight of what he'd just done. He'd rejected the only easy exit anyone was likely to offer. Tomorrow he would stand at an altar in front of people who despised him and marry a woman who was still mostly a stranger. He would bind himself to a life he didn't understand, in a world that didn't want him, for reasons that grew more complicated every day. But for the first time in months, he felt something that resembled peace. Not happiness or certainty or confidence about the future, just peace. The peace that came from making a choice, his choice, and living with the consequences, rather than being carried along by circumstances he couldn't control. He had made a decision, his decision. And whatever came next, at least it would be his. The night before the wedding, Marcus sat in his room staring at the suit that had been laid out for him. It was expensive, tailored specifically to his measurements by someone whose job was making suits for men who attended events at places like the Whitmore estate. But it still felt like a costume, something borrowed for a role he wasn't sure he knew how to play. Around 2 in the morning, there was a knock at his door. Marcus opened it to find Sophia in her wheelchair, dressed in a simple robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger than usual, more vulnerable. The careful composure she maintained in daylight softened by darkness and whatever had brought her to his door at this hour. "Can I come in?" Marcus stepped aside. She wheeled herself to the window that overlooked the grounds, looking out at darkness broken only by landscape lighting that marked pathways through gardens Marcus had barely explored. "I know my mother tried to buy you off." Sophia's voice was quiet but clear. "Rosa told me." Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, leaving space between them. "Does that change anything?" "It confirms something I suspected." She turned her chair to face him. "You're not like the others. The men who came before you. They wanted something from me. Power, money, access. I could see it in their eyes from the moment they walked through the door." She moved closer, the wheelchair's mechanism smooth and silent. "When you look at me, I don't see that. I see something else. I'm not sure what it is yet, but it's different. When I look at you, I see someone who's been hurt so many times she's built walls to keep everyone out." Marcus met her gaze directly. "I see someone who's testing me because she's afraid to trust. Not because there's something wrong with her, but because everyone else proved they couldn't be trusted." Sophia didn't deny it. "Is that so wrong? To want to know if someone is real before you let them in?" "No. But at some point you have to decide if you're going to keep testing or start living." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the armrest that Marcus was beginning to recognize as a tell, something she did when emotions got too close to the surface. "Tomorrow, everything changes." Her voice carried something Marcus hadn't heard before, something that might have been fear or hope or both tangled together, for both of us. "Are you ready for that?" Marcus thought about Isaiah, about the torn check on Victoria's library floor, about the garden conversation where he'd first glimpsed the person Sophia might be beneath the armor she wore. Thought about all the ways this could go wrong and the single way it might, against all odds, go right. "Are you?" Sophia didn't answer. She simply looked at him with those dark, searching eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. Then she turned and wheeled herself toward the door, stopping in the doorway without looking back. "Good night, Marcus." He watched her disappear down the hallway, the sound of the wheelchair fading into silence. Tomorrow he would stand at an altar and make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Would bind himself to a woman he barely knew for reasons that had started with desperation, but had somehow become more complicated. Would do it in front of a world that had already decided who he was and found him wanting. But tonight, in this quiet moment, something had shifted between them. Something small, but real. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was a beginning. The possibility of something genuine emerging from a transaction that should have been nothing but business. Marcus lay awake long after she'd gone, listening to the house settle around him, thinking about tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow, thinking about the man he'd been 6 months ago and the man he was becoming, wondering if the distance between those two versions of himself was a bridge forward or a betrayal of everything he'd once believed about what made a person worthy. He fell asleep without answers, which seemed appropriate. Nothing about this situation came with clear answers, just choices, consequences, and the hope that somewhere in the mess he was making, something worth having might eventually emerge. Morning arrived with the kind of clarity that made everything feel too sharp, too real, too immediate. Marcus woke to find the suit still hanging where it had been, waiting, patient. He showered in a bathroom larger than his old bedroom, put on clothes that fit better than anything he'd ever worn, and looked at himself in a mirror that showed him someone he almost didn't recognize. The man staring back looked successful. Looked like he belonged in rooms where decisions got made about other people's lives. Looked like someone who'd earned the right to stand at an altar in a cathedral and marry into one of the wealthiest families on the coast. But Marcus knew the truth. Knew the difference between looking like you belonged and actually belonging. Knew that every person who saw him today would be making that same calculation, measuring the distance between appearance and reality, and finding him lacking. Isaiah arrived with Rosa an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. His son wore a suit similar to Marcus's, smaller but just as carefully tailored, and the sight of him dressed like something from a magazine made Marcus's chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name. Pride and sadness and hope and fear all mixed together until he couldn't separate them. "You look good, little man." Isaiah tugged at his collar. "It's tight. You get used to it, do you?" Isaiah's question carried weight beyond comfort and clothing. "Do you get used to all of it?" Marcus knelt down, eye to eye with his son, and wished he had better answers. "I don't know yet, but we're going to figure it out together. Okay?" Isaiah nodded, then asked the question Marcus had been dreading. "Daddy, why are people so mean? About you and Miss Sophia?" "Because they don't understand." Marcus chose his words carefully. "They see things that don't match what they expect, and instead of changing what they expect, they decide what they see must be wrong. But you're not wrong." Isaiah's voice carried the fierce certainty of a child defending someone he loved. "You're good. I'm trying to be." Marcus pulled him close. "That's all any of us can do. Try to be good, even when people decide we're not." The limousine that took them to the cathedral was longer than Marcus's old apartment had been wide. Isaiah sat beside him in silence, looking out windows tinted dark enough that the world outside seemed distant and unreal. Rosa sat across from them, her expression neutral as always, but Marcus caught her watching him with something that might have been concern or approval. He couldn't tell which. The cathedral rose against the sky like something from another century, all stone and stained glass and the weight of tradition that money built into architecture to prove its permanence. Guests were already arriving, expensive cars depositing expensive people who would sit in expensive clothes and judge the spectacle they'd come to witness. Marcus took Isaiah's hand as they walked through a side entrance, avoiding the main doors where photographers and curious onlookers had gathered. Rosa led them through corridors that smelled like incense and aged, past rooms filled with flowers that would die in a week but cost enough to feed families for months. "You'll sit in the front row." Rosa spoke to Isaiah, gentle but firm. "Your father will be at the altar. When it's time, you'll come forward. Do you remember what we practiced?" Isaiah nodded, his hand tightening around Marcus's. They reached a small waiting room. Rosa gestured for Marcus to enter. 10 minutes. Then we begin." She left them alone, father and son in a room full of furniture no one sat on, surrounded by wealth that existed to prove it could exist. "I'm scared." Isaiah's voice was small, and Marcus hated that his choices had put fear into a child who'd already faced too much. "Me too." "Really? Really?" Marcus sat on an antique chair that probably cost more than a car. "Being scared doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it just means you're doing something important." Isaiah climbed into his lap, something he hadn't done in months, reverting to younger behaviors the way children did when the world got too big. "Is this important?" "Yes." Marcus held him close, breathing in the smell of the expensive shampoo Rosa had bought, missing the cheap soap they'd used in Brooklyn. "This is important. Not the wedding itself, not the money or the house or any of that, but trying to build something good from a hard situation. That's important." A knock at the door. Time. Marcus set Isaiah down, straightened both their ties, and walked toward the future he'd chosen, or that had chosen him. The distinction didn't seem to matter anymore. The cathedral was filled with people who had come to witness something they could discuss later at dinner parties and country clubs. 300 guests arranged in pews like an audience at a theater, waiting for the performance to begin. Marcus walked down the aisle alone, past faces he didn't know, past whispers he could hear despite their attempt at discretion. He sold himself for her money. A black man with nothing, marrying a crippled billionaire. How convenient. The words were variations on a theme he'd heard before, but repetition didn't make them easier to absorb. He kept his eyes forward, following his father's old advice, maintaining dignity through force of will. Victoria sat in the front row in pale blue silk, her face a mask of controlled displeasure. She hadn't spoken to Marcus since he'd torn her check 3 nights ago, but her silence communicated everything her words might have said. Beside her, in the seat Marcus had insisted on, Isaiah sat small and alone among strangers. His son's eyes found his and held, and Marcus drew strength from that connection, from the knowledge that at least one person in this cathedral saw him clearly. The minister stood at the altar in robes that probably had formal names Marcus didn't know. He gestured for Marcus to take his place, and Marcus stood where indicated, facing rows of judgment, waiting. The music changed. 300 people rose as one, turning toward the back of the cathedral. Marcus turned too. Sophia appeared at the far end of the aisle. An attendant pushed her wheelchair slowly, and she sat perfectly still in white silk that caught every light, her face composed, her hands folded, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She looked like something from a painting, beautiful and distant and untouchable. She didn't look at the guests, didn't acknowledge the whispers that followed her progress. She looked only at Marcus. The wheelchair reached the altar. The attendant stepped back. Sophia's hands were still folded in her lap, but Marcus could see her fingers trembling slightly. She was nervous. He hadn't expected that. Hadn't thought about what this moment might cost her, so focused on his own fear that he'd forgotten she was human too beneath the armor of wealth and position. The minister began speaking words that had been spoken in this cathedral for generations. Words about love and commitment, promises and partnerships, the binding of 2 lives into one. Marcus heard them distantly, his attention split between the ceremony unfolding around him and the woman beside him, who still hadn't looked away. He thought about the prenuptial agreement he'd signed, the 47 pages that made clear he was getting nothing but survival from this arrangement. Thought about the tears in the garden at midnight, the conversation through her door last night, the way she'd watched him for weeks without speaking, testing him in ways he hadn't fully understood, but had somehow passed. The minister asked if anyone objected to the union. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken dissent. Marcus could feel it pressing against him from all sides, 300 people who objected silently because speaking would require them to admit their prejudice out loud. No one spoke, but everyone objected. Everyone except him and Sophia. Then came the vows. Marcus spoke his carefully, meaning every word, even if the circumstances were unconventional. He promised to honor her, to stand beside her, to be her partner in whatever came next. His voice was steady. He had made his choice and would not waver from it now. Sophia began her vows, her voice clear and strong, but halfway through, she stopped. The minister looked confused. "Miss Bennet?" Sophia didn't respond to him. Instead, her hands moved to grip the armrests of her wheelchair. Her knuckles went white with pressure. Her jaw tightened with effort or determination, or both. And then, slowly, impossibly, she stood up. The gasp that swept through the cathedral was like a physical force. 300 people inhaled at once, their shock echoing off vaulted ceilings and stained glass, bouncing back and forth until the sound filled every space. Victoria's face went pale, all her careful control evaporating. The minister stumbled backward, his prepared words forgotten. Board members and old money families and everyone who'd come to judge this union stared with mouths open, their certainty about how the world worked suddenly called into question. Marcus felt his own shock register. He'd suspected something, noticed details that didn't align, but seeing her stand was different. Seeing her legs hold her weight, her spine straighten, her body reclaim space the wheelchair had occupied, was a revelation that changed everything he thought he understood. Sophia rose to her full height. Her legs trembled but held. She stood there at the altar, no longer the fragile woman who needed protection. She stood like someone who had been carrying a secret for too long and had finally decided to let it go. "I can walk." Her voice carried through the stunned silence. "I've been able to walk for 18 months. The whispers erupted into chaos. Guests turned to each other in confusion. Victoria gripped the pew in front of her as if she might faint, but Sophia wasn't finished. She took a step toward Marcus, then another. Her movements were careful, deliberate, like someone relearning how to trust their own body. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see tears gathering in her eyes despite her controlled expression. "You deserve to know the truth, all of it." Marcus stood motionless, trying to process what he was seeing, what she was saying, what this meant for everything they'd agreed to. "The wheelchair hasn't been medically necessary for a year." Sophia's voice remained steady, facts delivered without embellishment. "After the accident, I spent 2 years in physical therapy. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I recovered. I can walk. I can run. I can do everything I could do before." Her voice cracked slightly, but she continued. "But I kept the wheelchair. I told myself it was protection, a way to see who people really were before I let them get close. If they thought I was helpless, I could watch how they treated me. I could separate the ones who wanted my money from the ones who saw me as a person." She turned to face the congregation. 300 faces stared back at her, frozen in various states of shock and confusion. "But look at all of you now." Sophia's voice hardened, gaining strength. "Look at what you've been doing for the past 6 months. You called this man a gold digger. You called him a predator. You said he was using a disabled woman for her fortune." She pointed at Marcus. "This man knew nothing about my ability to walk. He agreed to marry me, believing I would be in that wheelchair for the rest of my life. He signed away every financial right. He rejected my mother's bribe of $2 million because he refused to be bought." Sophia's gaze swept across the crowd, holding individuals accountable with her stare. "And what did you do? You judged him. You mocked him. You taught your children to mock his child because he was poor, because he was black, because it was easier to believe he was a villain than to admit your own prejudice." The cathedral had gone completely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. The accusations hung in the air like indictments waiting for verdicts no one wanted to deliver. Sophia turned back to Marcus. "I used you as part of a test you never agreed to take. I let you suffer humiliation and judgment because I was too afraid to trust anyone. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." Marcus looked at her, his mind still reeling, still trying to absorb everything she'd revealed. She had lied to him, manipulated him, made him part of a game he hadn't known he was playing, let him face months of contempt and cruelty while she watched from behind a deception she'd chosen to maintain. He should be angry, had every right to be angry, every right to walk away from this altar, from this woman, from this life that had been built on foundations less stable than either of them had admitted. But when he looked at her face, really looked beneath the confession and the fear, he saw something he recognized. He saw a woman who had been abandoned so many times that she'd forgotten how to let anyone in. He saw someone who had built walls so high she couldn't see past them anymore. He saw himself. Different circumstances, but the same fundamental fear of being hurt by hope. "You lied to me." His voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. Sophia nodded. "Yes. You made me part of something I didn't choose." "Yes. And you let me face all of this without telling me why." "Yes." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I have no excuse, only an explanation. I was scared. I've been scared for 3 years, and fear made me do something unforgivable." Marcus was silent for a long moment. The entire cathedral waited, hanging on whatever he would say next. He thought about Isaiah sitting in the front row with frightened eyes, Thought about all the times his son had watched adults walk away from commitments when things got complicated. Marcus had learned too young that people leave, that trust was a risk most people weren't willing to take. What would it teach Isaiah if Marcus walked away now? That the moment things got difficult, you abandoned ship. That people who made mistakes didn't deserve second chances? That fear was a good enough reason to protect yourself at the expense of someone trying to build something real? I'm not going to pretend this doesn't change things. Marcus spoke loud enough now for the gathered witnesses to hear. You hurt me, you used me, and it's going to take time before I can trust you completely. He took a breath. But I also understand why you did it. The world hasn't been kind to you. It hasn't been kind to me either. We've both been judged by people who don't know us. We've both built walls to survive. He reached out and took her hands in his. They were trembling. If we're going to do this, then we do it honestly. No more tests, no more secrets, no more walls, just two people trying to build something real. Can you do that? Sophia's tears spilled over. I want to try. Then that's enough for now. A small voice cut through the silence. Daddy. Marcus turned. Isaiah had left his seat and was standing at the edge of the altar, looking up at his father with wide, uncertain eyes that held questions Marcus would spend years trying to answer. Is everything okay? Isaiah's voice was barely audible. Marcus knelt down so he was at eye level with his son. Everything is complicated, but I think it's going to be okay. Isaiah looked at Sophia, who was still standing, tears streaming down her face in a display of vulnerability that 300 strangers were witnessing. Are you mad at her? I was... a little. Marcus chose his words carefully, aware that his son was learning from this moment, absorbing lessons about forgiveness and grace that would shape who he became. But sometimes people do wrong things because they're scared. What matters is whether they try to make it right. Isaiah considered this with the serious expression of a child who'd learned too much about the world too soon. Then he looked at Sophia. My daddy said you play piano really good. Can you teach me sometime? Sophia let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She lowered herself carefully, her legs still unsteady from standing so long, until she was at Isaiah's level. I would love that, if you'll give me a chance. Isaiah looked at his father, then back at Sophia. Okay. It wasn't forgiveness. Not exactly. It was something smaller but no less significant. It was the willingness to begin, to try, to take the first uncertain step toward something that might become real if they all worked at it together. Marcus stood and helped Sophia to her feet. Together they turned to face the congregation. 300 people who had come expecting a scandal and found something they hadn't anticipated. Silence stretched across the cathedral like a held breath. Victoria sat frozen in her seat, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. She had orchestrated this marriage to control her daughter, to maintain appearances, to keep power firmly in her grip through a husband she'd chosen for his powerlessness. She had never expected Sophia to stand up, literally or figuratively. Mother. Sophia's voice carried clearly through the silent church. I know this isn't what you planned. I know you wanted a quiet arrangement that you could control. She took Marcus's hand. But I'm done being controlled by you, by fear, by the assumptions everyone makes about who I am and what I'm worth. This man stood at this altar ready to honor a commitment he made, knowing it would cost him his reputation, knowing the whole world was against him. He didn't run when you tried to buy him off. He didn't run when I gave him every reason to. She lifted her chin. That's more than anyone else has ever done for me. Victoria said nothing. For once in her carefully managed life, she had no response, no countermove prepared. Her face remained pale, her composure shattered by a daughter who had learned to play the game better than she'd been taught. Sophia turned to the minister, who stood slack-jawed near the pulpit. We're ready to continue, if that's all right with you. The minister blinked several times, fumbled with his book. Yes. Yes, of course. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. Rings were exchanged, simple bands that felt inadequate to the weight of what had just happened. Final vows were spoken, these ones unrehearsed, pulled from somewhere honest that neither of them had accessed before today. When the minister pronounced them married, there was no applause, no cheering. Just the heavy silence of a crowd that had witnessed something they were still trying to understand. Marcus and Sophia walked down the aisle together, not as a man pushing a wheelchair, but as two people walking side by side, choosing each step. Isaiah held his father's other hand, matching their pace with careful steps that suggested he understood the significance of this moment, even if he couldn't articulate it. Behind them, the wheelchair sat empty at the altar, abandoned, a relic of the past, of fears and pretenses and walls that had been built into something more than just a medical device. Outside, the winter sun was bright and cold. Marcus squinted against the light, feeling Sophia's hand warm in his, Isaiah's smaller hand trusting in his other. Photographers shouted questions they didn't answer. Guests filed out behind them with faces that registered shock, confusion, grudging respect, and in a few cases, something that might have been shame. What happens now? Marcus kept his voice low enough that only Sophia could hear. I don't know. She admitted it freely, the confession easier after everything else she'd revealed. I've never gotten this far before. Marcus looked down at Isaiah, who was staring up at the sky with an expression of wonder he hadn't worn in months. He looked back at Sophia, this woman who had deceived him and revealed herself, who was standing on her own 2 feet for the first time in front of the world. We figure it out, one day at a time. Sophia squeezed his hand. Together. Together. They walked toward the waiting car, leaving behind the cathedral, the stairs, the whispers that would continue long after they were gone. Ahead of them lay uncertainty, challenges, the hard work of building trust from scratch. Victoria would not accept defeat quietly. The world would not stop judging overnight. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt something he had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Not the desperate kind that came from having no options. Real hope. The kind that came from choosing your own path, even when the path was hard. The kind that came from finding someone who saw you clearly and decided you were worth the risk. The immediate aftermath happened in stages, each one revealing new layers of consequence. Victoria left the cathedral before the reception began, driven away in a car that departed with enough speed to communicate rage without requiring words. Board members who had attended expecting routine nuptials found themselves witnessing a corporate power shift they hadn't anticipated. Rosa found Marcus and Sophia in a side room where they'd retreated to catch their breath. She carried documents that she spread across an antique table with the efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment. The board meets in 3 days. Rosa's voice was businesslike. No congratulations offered because this wasn't that kind of marriage yet. Victoria will try to challenge Sophia's position. These are the proxies you'll need, the voting blocks that matter, the alliances that were waiting for someone to activate them. Sophia studied the papers, her hand still holding Marcus's like she was afraid to let go. How long have you been planning this? Since the day your mother chose Marcus. Rosa allowed herself a small smile. I knew if she picked wrong, if she chose someone who could actually stand up to her, we'd have an opportunity. Marcus was the first candidate who looked like he might be real. You've been playing both sides. Marcus felt admiration mixed with wariness. The woman who'd brought him into this world had her own agenda all along. I've been playing your side. Rosa met his eyes. Your mother cleaned houses for 20 years, including for families like this. She saw how they treated people, how they used people. When I recognized your name, I knew I had a chance to do something she would have wanted. Give someone decent a shot at changing the system from inside. Marcus absorbed that. The revelation that even his entrance into this world had been more calculated than he'd known. But Rosa's calculation had given him options when he'd had none, so he couldn't entirely resent it. The reception was subdued, guests uncertain how to behave after the revelations they'd witnessed. Some left early, their discomfort making it impossible to maintain social niceties. Others stayed out of curiosity or obligation, circulating through rooms at the Whitmore estate while trying to process what Sophia's standing meant for the narrative they'd constructed. Marcus found himself cornered by a board member named Harrison Cole, a man in his 70s who'd made his fortune in pharmaceuticals and apparently felt entitled to opinions about other people's choices. "Quite a show you put on." Harrison's voice carried condescension wrapped in civility. "I suppose we should congratulate you on your strategic positioning." Marcus kept his face neutral. "If you have something to say it directly." "Very well." Harrison stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You may have impressed some people with your performance today, but don't mistake Sophia's moment of vulnerability for permanent change. This family, this company, operates on principles you don't understand. When the novelty wears off, you'll find yourself exactly where Victoria intended you to be." "Irrelevant." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "You're probably right that I don't understand how things work in your world, but I understand something you might have forgotten. People aren't assets to be managed. They're not pieces on a board you move around. And when you spend too long treating them that way, you forget they can move themselves." He walked away before Harrison could respond, found Isaiah sitting alone at a table picking at cake he wasn't eating. "You okay, little man?" Isaiah shrugged, the gesture carrying more weight than words. "Kids from school are here. They're looking at me weird." "Let them look." Marcus sat beside his son. "What they think doesn't change who you are, but it changes how they treat me." The observation was too perceptive, too aware of social dynamics that 10-year-olds shouldn't have to navigate. Marcus pulled Isaiah close, wishing he could protect him from every hard lesson the world insisted on teaching. "Yeah, it does. And that's not fair, and I'm sorry you have to deal with it. But you're stronger than they know. Stronger than they'll ever be because you learned how to keep going when things were hard. They've never had to do that." Sophia found them there, having changed from her wedding dress into something simpler but no less elegant. She'd been walking for hours now, her legs holding up despite months of calculated disuse. She sat across from them, and Marcus noticed other guests watching, recalibrating their assessments. "Isaiah," Sophia's voice was gentle, "your father told me you like science. Is that true?" Isaiah nodded, cautious but interested. "I have a laboratory at the company. We test medical devices, run simulations. Would you like to visit sometime? See how things work?" "Really?" "Really?" Sophia smiled, and Marcus realized it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Your father is right that you're stronger than you know. But strong people also need places where they belong. Maybe you'd like the lab." Isaiah's face lit up in a way Marcus hadn't seen since before the hospital, before the debt, before everything got complicated. "Can I bring my science project? I'm building a model heart. I'd love to see it." Marcus watched his son come alive in conversation with Sophia, watched her engage with genuine interest rather than the performance of interest, and felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't the transaction he'd signed up for. This was something more complicated and potentially more valuable. This was the possibility of family, real family, built from choice rather than circumstance. The board meeting 3 days later was held in a conference room with windows overlooking the city from the 42nd floor of Whitmore Medical Technologies headquarters. Marcus wasn't required to attend, but Sophia had asked him to be there, and he'd agreed despite feeling completely out of his depth in a room full of people who made decisions about billions of dollars. Victoria sat at one end of the long table, her composure restored, her expression neutral. She'd been working the phones for 3 days, Marcus knew from Rosa, calling in favors and applying pressure to board members who might be persuaded to support a challenge to Sophia's authority. Sophia sat at the other end in the CEO's chair, no wheelchair visible anywhere. She'd walked into the building, taken the elevator, entered this room on her own feet. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but subtlety wasn't the point. Harrison Cole called the meeting to order. We're here to discuss concerns raised by Mrs. Whitmore regarding the stability of current leadership. Victoria stood, her voice measured and professional. My daughter's recent actions demonstrate a pattern of deception that raises legitimate questions about her judgment. She falsified a medical condition for 18 months, misleading board members, shareholders, and the public. This level of dishonesty is incompatible with the fiduciary responsibility required of a CEO. The argument was clever, twisting Sophia's revelation into evidence of untrustworthiness rather than strength. Several board members nodded, the logic appealing to people who valued predictability over authenticity. Sophia let her mother finish before responding. She stood, and Marcus saw Victoria's jaw tighten at the visual reminder. My mother is correct that I deceived people. Sophia's voice was calm, factual. I maintained a fiction about my medical condition because I wanted to see how people treated me when they believed I was vulnerable. What I learned was illuminating. She pulled out a folder, distributed copies to board members. These are emails from the past 18 months. Conversations between certain board members and my mother discussing how best to manage me, how to limit my authority, how to ensure I remained dependent on advice from people who had their own interests at heart. Victoria's face went pale as board members opened folders and began reading. Marcus couldn't see the contents from where he sat, but he watched faces change as information registered. You'll notice references to my marriage, Sophia continued. My mother selected Marcus specifically because she believed his desperation would make him controllable. The plan was to use our marriage as evidence that I lacked judgment, that I needed oversight. What she didn't anticipate was that Marcus would refuse to be controlled. Sophia looked directly at her mother. You tried to buy him off with $2 million. He rejected it. Not because he didn't need the money, but because he understood something you've forgotten. Dignity isn't for sale. Harrison Cole was reading the emails with an expression that shifted from neutral to concerned. Mrs. Whitmore, are these communications authentic? Victoria's silence was answer enough. Around the table, board members exchanged glances, alliances shifting in real time as they recalculated whose interests aligned with their own. I propose a motion. Rosa spoke from the back of the room, her presence unexpected but not unprecedented. She attended board meetings as staff liaison, Marcus had learned, though she rarely spoke. That Victoria Whitmore's voting rights be suspended pending an investigation into potential breaches of fiduciary duty. The motion was seconded. The vote was swift and decisive. Victoria was stripped of her power in the company her family had built, removed by people she'd considered allies, betrayed by the same mechanisms she'd used to try to control her daughter. Victoria stood, gathered her things with trembling hands. You think you've won. She directed this at Sophia, her voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. You think marrying that man and standing up changes anything? But you're still my daughter, still broken by what happened. And eventually, everyone will see it. Sophia met her mother's gaze without flinching. I am your daughter. And yes, I'm still broken in some ways. But broken things can heal if you let them. You never learned that lesson. Victoria left without responding, the click of her heels against marble floors marking her departure like punctuation on a closed chapter. After she was gone, the meeting continued with discussions about quarterly projections and pipeline developments and all the mundane business of running a company worth billions. Marcus sat through it feeling like an observer in a world that operated by rules he didn't fully understand. But he noticed how board members addressed Sophia now, with respect that had been carefully calibrated before but felt more genuine after. She'd proven something today, though Marcus wasn't entirely sure what. When the meeting ended, Sophia found him in the hallway. You didn't have to sit through all that. I wanted to understand. Marcus had been taking mental notes, trying to map the power dynamics and relationships that governed this world. If I'm going to be part of this, I should know how it works. Sophia studied him with the same intensity she'd shown during their first meeting. You could leave, you know. The prenup means you'd leave with nothing, but you could walk away, start over somewhere else. Is that what you want? I want to know you're staying because you choose to, not because you're trapped. Marcus thought about the question he'd been asking himself for weeks. Was he trapped? The prenup meant he had no financial incentive to stay beyond his salary, which, while comfortable, was nothing compared to the wealth surrounding them. He could leave, rebuild his life on his own terms, raise Isaiah without the complications of navigating a world that didn't want them. But leaving meant abandoning the possibility of something real. It meant teaching Isaiah that when things got difficult, when people made mistakes, you ran rather than working to repair what was broken. I'm not trapped. Marcus chose each word carefully. I'm choosing to stay, for now, because I think there's something here worth building. But you need to understand, Sophia, I'm not your employee. I'm not your decoration. If we do this, we do it as equals, partners. Not because the contract says so, but because we both decide that's what we want. Sophia's eyes held his for a long moment. Then she nodded. Partners. They shook hands formally, sealing an agreement that mattered more than the legal documents they'd signed weeks ago. This was a choice, mutual and deliberate, to try building something real from the wreckage of everything that had come before. 18 months passed in a rhythm of adjustment and negotiation. Marcus and Sophia moved from the massive estate to a smaller house in Marin County, still expensive by normal standards, but human-scaled in ways the mansion never was. The $2 million purchase was made jointly, both their names on the deed, a symbolic statement about shared investment in their future. Marcus used capital. Sophia insisted on lending him interest-free to partner with Luis, the groundskeeper from the estate who'd been quietly friendly during Marcus's early months there. Together, they opened an auto repair shop that specialized in adaptive vehicle modifications for people with disabilities. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, but the work felt meaningful in ways Marcus's previous jobs never had. Sophia remained CEO, but restructured the company's board and policies. She implemented new protocols around disability accommodation, hired Rosa as Chief Operations Officer, and began using the company's resources to fund research into medical debt relief programs. She also started a foundation called Second Chances, which cleared medical debt for families struggling under the weight of healthcare costs. In the first 18 months, the foundation cleared debt for 73 families. The number was specific, intentional. Sophia kept a list of names, amounts, lives changed by money that was insignificant to her personal wealth, but transformative to people who'd been drowning. Marcus helped review cases, his experience lending perspective Sophia didn't have about what poverty actually meant beyond theoretical understanding. Isaiah thrived at Whitmore Academy once the initial shock wore off, and students realized his father wasn't going anywhere. He spent weekends at the lab Sophia had mentioned, actually helping with minor projects under the supervision of engineers who appreciated his genuine interest. Marcus watched his son grow into confidence that hadn't existed back in Brooklyn, watched him stop apologizing for taking up space. But not everything was smooth. Victoria attempted several legal challenges to Sophia's control of the company, all of which failed but created stress that rippled through their lives. Media coverage of their marriage shifted from mockery to fascination but never quite reached acceptance. Marcus still encountered people who treated him like he'd won a lottery he hadn't deserved, who looked at Sophia with pity for settling. And there were nights when the weight of it all felt crushing. When Marcus lay awake wondering if he'd traded his authentic self for a comfortable life. When Sophia withdrew into old patterns of isolation and testing, forgetting momentarily that they'd agreed to build something different. When Isaiah asked questions about his mother, the woman who'd left them, and Marcus didn't have answers that felt adequate. But there were also mornings when Sophia made coffee the way Marcus liked it without being asked. Evenings when Isaiah taught them both about photosynthesis with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found his passion. Moments when Marcus caught Sophia watching him work on a car engine and saw something in her face that looked like contentment. Slowly, incrementally, they built something that resembled a marriage. Not the fairy tale version where everything worked perfectly, but the real version where two damaged people learned to navigate damage together, where trust was earned through consistency rather than declared through contract, where love, if that's what was growing between them, emerged from choice rather than circumstance. Victoria's final attempt at reconciliation came on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 years after the wedding. She appeared at their house in Marin without warning, looking smaller than Marcus remembered. 2 years and multiple legal defeats had diminished her somehow, stripped away the armor of certainty she'd worn like a second skin. Sophia answered the door with obvious reluctance. Marcus stood behind her, support if she needed it, but letting her decide how to handle this. "I'm not here to fight." Victoria's voice carried exhaustion Marcus hadn't heard before. "I'm here because my therapist says I need to try making amends, for what it's worth." Sophia didn't invite her in, but she didn't close the door either. "What exactly are you trying to make amends for?" "For trying to control you. For treating your husband like he was a problem to be solved rather than a person. For not seeing that my fear of losing you was actually pushing you away." The apology was stilted, clearly rehearsed, but Marcus heard genuine emotion underneath the formal language. Victoria was trying, however imperfectly. "I'm not ready to forgive you." Sophia's voice was firm, but not cruel. "You hurt me, hurt my husband, hurt my stepson. You put your own need for control above everyone else's humanity. That's not something I can just accept because you finally got therapy." Victoria nodded, accepting the boundary. "I understand. I just wanted you to know I'm working on it. On understanding why I did what I did. On becoming someone who could deserve forgiveness, even if you never give it." She turned to Marcus. "I owe you an apology specifically. I saw you as a threat because of your race, your class, your circumstances. I assumed the worst about you because it was easier than questioning my own prejudices. That was wrong. You've been better to my daughter than anyone she married into money could have been." Marcus considered the apology, weighed its sincerity against the harm it attempted to address. "I appreciate you saying that. I don't know if I can forgive you either, but I can acknowledge you're trying." Victoria left shortly after, driving away in a car far less expensive than the one she'd arrived in 2 years ago. Sophia watched her go, then turned to Marcus. "Do you think people can really change?" Marcus thought about the man he'd been in Brooklyn, desperate and afraid, willing to sell pieces of himself for survival. Thought about who he was now, still figuring out the answer but at least asking the question from a position of stability. "I think people can change if they want to badly enough. If they're willing to sit with discomfort long enough to understand where it comes from. Whether your mother wants to badly enough, I don't know." Sophia leaned against him, a gesture of trust they'd developed slowly over months. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready to let her back in. You don't have to decide today. Or this year. Or ever. She hurt you. You get to decide what reconciliation looks like, if it looks like anything at all." They stood together in the doorway of the house they'd chosen together, watching the sun set over hills that had become familiar. This was their corner of the world now. Small compared to the estate Sophia had grown up in, but theirs in ways that mattered more than square footage. The Foundation's second anniversary gala was held at a hotel in San Francisco, attended by donors and families whose debt had been cleared, and board members who'd learned to work with Sophia's new approach. Marcus wore a suit that actually fit this time, tailored to his measurements rather than borrowed, comfortable in his own skin in ways he hadn't been 2 years ago. Isaiah attended as well, now 12, and startlingly articulate about cardiac development, explaining to anyone who'd listen how the Foundation's work connected to his own experience with medical debt. Sophia had helped him prepare a short speech, and watching his son stand at a podium in front of 200 people and speak confidently about second chances made Marcus's chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name. After the speeches and the dinner and the networking that Marcus was getting better at, even if it never felt natural, he found himself on the hotel's terrace with Sophia. The city spread out below them, lights marking lives being lived in buildings they'd never enter. "Do you ever regret it?" Sophia's question was quiet, vulnerable in ways she allowed herself to be now that hadn't been possible before. The contract. The wedding. All of it? Marcus thought about the question he'd been asked in various forms for 2 years. The honest answer was complicated. I regret how we started. I regret that desperation was what brought us together instead of choice. I regret the pain Isaiah went through, the judgment we all faced, the way your mother tried to use us both. He took Sophia's hand, feeling how familiar it had become. But I don't regret where we ended up. We built something real from a transaction that should have stayed hollow. That's worth something. Sophia leaned against the railing, her posture relaxed in ways it never was around other people. I spent 3 years after Jonathan died, convinced I'd never trust anyone again. Then I spent 18 months testing men who failed every test because I'd designed them to fail. With you, I didn't design anything. You just kept showing up as yourself. Marcus smiled. Stubborn, my mother used to call it. Isaiah found them on the terrace, carrying a plate of desserts he'd accumulated from the buffet. He wedged himself between them, and they adjusted automatically to make space. "Daddy." Isaiah's voice carried the considering tone that meant a serious question was coming. "If you could go back and know everything that would happen, would you still make the same choice?" Marcus looked at his son, at the boy who'd been scared and small in Brooklyn and was now confident and curious and secure. Looked at Sophia, who'd learned to stand literally and figuratively. Looked at the city spreading below them, full of lives being shaped by choices large and small. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Every hard thing we went through led us here. And here is pretty good. Isaiah considered this, eating his desserts with the focused attention of someone processing complex information. Okay, that makes sense. They stood together on that terrace, an unlikely family built from broken pieces that had somehow fit together. Not perfect, never perfect, but real, chosen, theirs. Sophia pulled out her phone, showed Marcus a message that had arrived during dinner. It was from a woman named Jennifer in Ohio, one of the 73 families whose debt the foundation had cleared. She'd written to say her daughter was starting college, fully funded by scholarships and savings that hadn't been eaten by medical bills. The message included a photo of the daughter in front of her dorm, arms spread wide like she was embracing the world. We changed her corner. Sophia's voice carried quiet satisfaction. Not the whole world, but her corner. That matters. Marcus thought about all the corners they'd changed. 73 families, yes, but also board members who'd learned to question their assumptions. Isaiah's classmates who'd seen that people could be more than surface judgments. Rosa, who'd finally been able to use her position to help someone the way she'd wished she could help Marcus's mother years ago. Small changes in many corners, adding up to something larger than any single action. We're not done yet. Marcus pulled both Sophia and Isaiah closer. There's more corners to change. How many? Isaiah asked. As many as we can reach. They stayed on that terrace until the gala wound down and staff began cleaning up inside. When they finally left, walking through the hotel to their car, Marcus caught sight of their reflection in the glass doors. A family. Imperfect and hard-won, and real. The drive home took them over the Golden Gate Bridge, lights reflecting off the water below. Isaiah fell asleep in the back seat. Sophia drove, Marcus beside her, both comfortable with silence that had become companionable. They pulled into the driveway of the house they'd chosen together, carried their sleeping son inside, moved through their nighttime routine with practiced efficiency. In the quiet afterward, Marcus thought about the man he'd been standing outside the Whitmore Hotel 6 months ago, desperate and afraid. Sometimes the best things emerged from the worst circumstances. Sometimes dignity meant knowing when to bend. Sometimes love grew in the quiet work of showing up. Isaiah stirred, Sophia smiled, Marcus squeezed her hand. For that moment, everything felt exactly as it should be. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything.